Hello and welcome. I'm Catherine Patterson. I'm the co-executive director of CityHealth, along with my counterpart, Katrina Forrest, who is off this week. 2 weeks ago, CityHealth and our partners at Enterprise Community Partners and the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel released a new report exploring 3 effective policy solutions that cities can use to help address local housing challenges. It was wonderful that many of you joined us on August 25th for our webinar on those 2 policies, affordable housing trust and healthy rental housing. If you missed that event, we have a recording available on our website and on our YouTube channel. Today, we're pleased to be joined by the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, or NCCRC for short, to talk about legal support for renters. But before I hand it off, I'd like to introduce CityHealth to those of you who may be joining us for the very first time. In 2014, CityHealth was founded at the de Beaumont Foundation with a mission to promote upstream, health-related and equitable policy interventions in America's largest cities. In 2018, Kaiser Permanente, the nation's largest private integrated healthcare delivery system, joined the de Beaumont Foundation as CityHealth's second national partner. CityHealth works to advance a package of policy solutions that have a track record of having bipartisan support and can result in positive health outcomes for individuals and communities. This particular slide shows our very first policy package, which featured 9 specific policies. We worked with the nation's 40 largest cities to adopt these policies and awarded gold, silver, and bronze medals based on the strength and number of the policies that they had on the books. I have to say, we were astounded by the response we had in our first 5 years. When we put out our first report, less than half of the largest cities earned an overall medal. I think it was about 48%. But just 5 years later, more than 90% of cities earned an overall medal. And that impacts the lives of over 44 million people here in America. Starting this year, we've adopted a new 2.0 policy package of 12 policies, and we're expanding the number of cities that we work with from 40 to the largest 75. These policies are designed to help all people have access to a safe place to live, a healthy body and mind, and a thriving environment. But we don't do this alone. We work with a number of subject matter experts who provide technical assistance and implementation support for cities. We're proud to partner with NCCRC on our legal support for renters policy. NCCRC works tirelessly with cities and local advocates around the country to advance right to counsel policies. They are the foremost experts in this area, and I am so glad that they can join us today to speak with you all. I'd now like to introduce John Pollock. John has been the coordinator of the NCCRC since 2009, and he was the recipient of NLADA's 2018 Innovations in Civil Justice Award. He is the author of a number of law review articles and previously has worked for both the Central Alabama Fair Housing Center and the Southern Poverty Law Center. John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I wanted to just lay out quickly what we'll be discussing in the next segment of this webinar. The first thing we're going to do is talk about the context in which these recommendations come. The eviction picture that we're facing in this country have been for some time and are facing increasingly because of the pandemic. And then secondly, what legal support for renter policies look like and why they're a worthwhile and proven response to this crisis. Next slide, please. So the numbers for evictions are really dire. 3.6 million eviction filings in a typical year. That is an extraordinary number of people when you consider that each filing in many cases affects more than just one person. These are families, often larger families that are facing eviction. And what we know from the data is that it has a disproportionate impact on communities of color, that they, through reasons of historical racism and current racism, are more often renters and more often subject to eviction filings that devastate their lives and their communities. And the pandemic protections that were put in place from 2020 on many of those protections, like the eviction moratoria and other things that cities and states erected and the federal government erected, some of those are already gone. And the ones that aren't are winding down. Courts are starting to go back to, quote, business as usual, even though the country is far from being back to it, even where we were prior to the pandemic. Families are still reeling from the impacts of COVID, continuing to suffer illness and loss of jobs and other factors like that. So when you look at that, that level of filings and the race equity concerns and the lack of other protections, it starts to make it clearer why you need a right to counsel. And additionally, I should say that the pandemic protections that we did have, some of those were not as effective because there was not counsel to make sure that they were being enforced by the landlords and by the courts. And this goes to the next statistic that we have here, which is what the status of representation is. What we know from our data is that, generally speaking, about 3% of tenants have access to counsel in eviction proceedings. That is a minuscule number, and one that indicates why the system is so much the way it is. It's operated in an environment where it's expected that tenants are not going to have a lawyer when the proceeding begins. The judge does not expect them to have one. The landlord does not expect them to have one. And there are consequences from that expectation in terms of the way that business is done in those courts. Conversely, over 80% of landlords have access to representation. So just a massive disparity of power in this relationship. And one, I should say too, that really goes beyond just representation. Even if neither side has representation, the interests at stake for the two parties are not identical. The families, the tenants, are the ones whose homes are at stake and face all of the collateral consequences if those homes are lost, to their child custody, to their jobs, to their children's access to education, and so on. While there is funding from the Federal Legal Services Corporation to cities and state legal aid programs, they can't address 71% of the legal issues brought to them per year. And that's just the ones that make it to them. So we're talking about a massive hole in the infrastructure of support that exists where right to counsel does not exist. Next slide, please. So there are many impacts that evictions have on families, but in the context of this conversation, it's really important to note the impact on health, public health, and family health. We have a great expert, Kate Leifheit, who will be speaking on the panel later and going more into detail on some of these factors, but it's worth highlighting that evictions on their own and as a cause of homelessness have been documented to show major connections to people's mental and physical health. And it's important to note that even where people are not evicted, even just going through an eviction proceeding has an extremely adverse effect on mental health and physical health because of the way that those proceedings are conducted, because of the expectations put on the tenants and what they have to do to fight for their own rights without any help in those proceedings. But certainly where they're evicted, where they live on the street, where they have constant house changes, where they're forced to live in substandard housing because of their destroyed credit and their lack of options, which leads to increased health problems, where they lose their possessions and therefore lose access to their medications and medical devices if they're forced out suddenly from their unit, they don't get sufficient time to move, their possessions are put on the street, and so on, where their children are affected by the move out, by the constant moving that's caused often by an eviction, and by, during COVID, the fact that being evicted has placed tenants at a much higher risk of infection and death because of being in doubled up or tripled up housing as a result of being evicted or living on the street. So there's so many ways in which evictions have a dramatic impact on health, and why the right to counsel, which we will discuss later, has been proven to stop those evictions and therefore halt all of these collateral consequences that come afterward. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before that evictions are a race equity issue, and we know that because we have this data that has been coming in from the census during the pandemic and from the eviction lab that has found that Black renters, especially Black female renters, are twice as likely to face eviction than white renters, and that they are a disproportionate, Black individuals in general are a disproportionate percentage of all eviction defendants comparison compared to their size of the population overall. So, we're looking at a system that is massively discriminatory, in both the potentially an intent and an impact. So that is such a significant motivator for us in wanting to do this work and looking at who is suffering the consequences of the lack of counsel. Next slide, please. So what does a legal support for renters policy look like? Well, a legal support for renters policy in another name is a right to counsel. And what a right to counsel is an enactment in law that has government funding and that ensures that all eligible tenants facing eviction have the right to a lawyer. So basically, although it's called legal support for renters, it actually does not mean just simply increasing representation or increasing access. It means providing a guarantee of that access to counsel for any tenants that were eligible. Eligibility requirements vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There may be income limits, there may be other requirements for tenants to meet, but provided that they meet those requirements, they are entitled to receive that representation. They can expect to receive it. And the jurisdiction is communicating that expectation to these communities, telling them we've got you. We understand these proceedings are not equitable, and we're going to promise you have counsel. This is different from a pilot or increased funding, very noble and worthwhile efforts that can help on the road to a right to counsel, but themselves generally don't guarantee that people who get counsel through those means are actually guaranteed that access. There's no law, there's no ordinance, there's no bill or statute that says these people are entitled. There's simply funding provided that helps that happen. And again, with the law, there has to be funding, government funding. It's a government obligation. Next slide, please. So the primary benefits we're going to talk about in more detail, my colleague Maria will talk about in more detail, but what we know is that this is a data-proven, evidence-based solution. It is effective in changing outcomes. It keeps people housed, many people, and for those who do not stay housed, either because they do not want to stay in their unit or because they can't, it helps promote long-term housing stability by doing things like helping the eviction stay off their record, by reducing the arrears that they pay, by providing them more time to move so they're not violently displaced. And by doing that, it mitigates all of the secondary impacts of eviction. If a tenant isn't disruptively displaced, if they actually have the time they need to move, if they're helped with finding new housing, if their credit isn't destroyed in the process, they're much more likely to locate housing that isn't substandard, housing that is within their affordability range, housing that's not going to be segregated and disruptive to their lives. And so by doing all of that, it then subsequently helps to close health and racial disparities. Next slide, please. So with that, I would like to turn things over to my colleague, Maria Rubianceva. She's the Associate Coordinator at the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, who's going to talk more about what we know about the benefits of providing counsel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. A legal support for renters policy, as John just mentioned in the last slide, is truly an evidence-based and cost-effective intervention that prevents more evictions from happening and really alleviates the attendant harms of eviction. So as we highlight in this report, studies looking at the impact of representation of tenants facing eviction have found over and over again that representation is an effective intervention. Represented tenants are avoiding disruptive displacement over 90% of the time. They're also more likely to avoid homelessness and the use of homeless shelters. One study out of Minnesota found that represented tenants were 4 times less likely to use a homeless shelter. In addition, represented tenants are more likely to remain in their homes. So what we know out of a study out of Oklahoma, for instance, is that representation increased unit retention by 75%, while in California, fully represented tenants stayed in their units approximately 3 times as often as a comparison group. Another very important, so critical finding has to do with eviction records. A mere filing of eviction, regardless of disposition, can attach to a tenant's record for years, and it can disrupt housing opportunity and mobility for many years to come. So when tenants are represented, what we know out of studies that have looked at this particular issue, tenants with representation are just more likely to have a clear eviction record where laws in that state permit that to happen. In California, for example, 91% of Shriver Housing pilot project clients, and that pilot project is explored in a little bit more detail in the report, Of those clients who had to move, 91% of them had their records sealed. Finally, represented tenants who have to vacate or who have the desire to vacate, that's one of the goals of one of their goals in representation, they often have more time and more money to do so. So they're able to vacate with a little bit more dignity than unrepresented tenants. In 2 separate studies, one in Minnesota, one in California, represented tenants had about twice as long to move as unrepresented tenants. And next slide, please. So not only looking at those benefits that were explored on that slide and are also explored in more detail in the report, tenants really need legal representation to navigate the eviction proceedings and all of the attendant considerations that are part of being a defendant in an eviction. Evictions are legal proceedings. They're governed by substantive and procedural and often very complicated law. That includes statutes, case law, local laws, regulations, court rules. Tenant attorneys are able to identify and advance those substantive and procedural legal defenses that already exist in the law, and they're able to advance those legal defenses in ways that unrepresented tenants can't. Or often typically cannot. So just by way of example, a survey of rent court respondents in Baltimore, for instance, found that 80%, while 80% of tenants had a potential defense, only 8% of those who were not represented could successfully assert that defense. Tenant attorneys are also able to raise conditions issues. They're able to gather that relevant evidence to substantiate those issues and to negotiate solutions for those conditions issues. And this specific benefit of having legal representation really connects back to that healthy rental housing program that's discussed more fully in the report. Tenant advocates, tenant attorneys are just able to give teeth to and enforce critical tenant protections that are already on the books and that cities have already implemented. Tenant attorneys are also critical because they help negotiate increased time, decreased costs, and that clean eviction record. So those findings that we discussed on the prior slide and are more explored in the report. Finally, as evidenced in the most recent kind of evaluation of a legal support policy that's already implemented, already working. So out of Cleveland, and as an independent evaluation found, tenant representation really helps tenants become aware of, apply for, and obtain those crucial social support services that tenants need, either to avoid eviction, so rental assistance programs, for instance, or when they do have to vacate, so making use of housing search services, for example. Next slide, please. Legal support for renters policies have also been evaluated for their cost effectiveness in jurisdictions. So the first 3 studies that are listed out on this slide and also explored in a little bit more detail in the report, they've been conducted by Stout, Racius, Ross, and really look at the estimated economic impact of implementing a right to counsel policy in those named cities. So as you can see, when you look at this, legal support for renters policies, of course they do, as other policies do, require that initial investment to stand up a program and to build capacity to represent all eligible tenants. But the reality is that the savings in the long run substantially overtake the cost of the program. So the 2016 report that's referenced on the slide for New York City, really, it found that it was estimated that implementing a right to counsel would result in an approximate net savings cost of about $320 million. And that looked at really reducing homeless shelter costs, among other savings. In Baltimore, it was estimated every dollar invested in a right to counsel program by the city would result in $6.24 in savings in value for those services for the city and the state. And in Philadelphia, an investment of $3.5 million at the forefront to stand up a program would help the city avoid approximately $45 million in annual costs. The Cleveland evaluation that is referenced at the end of the slide looks at an existing right to counsel program And so that 2021 evaluation found that the city and the county avoided social safety net costs of approximately $1.8 to $1.9 million, and that the city and county retained about 2.5 to 2.8 million in federal funding and economic value. I note that the report states that this is likely an understatement of the actual fiscal impact of this policy, because there are benefits that accrue to the city and the county that are just unable to be quantified or were not quantified for the purposes of that report. Next slide, please. So now we get to really thinking about maybe this is a policy for your city. The NCCRC, we support cities across the country, many cities across the country that are considering legal support for renters and right to counsel policies. So as cities assess and craft legal support for renters policies, there are really critical considerations to take into account. First, providing representation to all tenants facing eviction. So this might sound very large. It's a very broad kind of encompassing all tenants facing eviction, but this has been done in several cities, Boulder and San Francisco, to name just two. And the reality is that a policy that covers all tenants, it eases the administrative burdens of assessing eligibility, while the primary beneficiaries of that policy remain low income and extremely low income tenants, and that can be seen from findings out of San Francisco. Cities should also aim for enhanced coverage. So by enhanced coverage, what we're talking about is beyond court-based evictions. We're talking about incorporating administrative proceedings that also that could cut off a tenant's subsidy, that could cut off a tenant's tenancy in an administrative setting, and that could lead to court-based evictions, or it could just lead to a tenant leaving after that tenancy or subsidy is cut off. And also covering appeals and covering affirmative cases where tenants can choose to enforce those policies, those tenant protections that already exist, habitability standards and fair housing laws, for instance. Finally, cities should consider an evaluation and reporting requirement. So evaluations and reporting, such as annual reports, are really important for identifying blind spots, assessing the program, assessing implementation, building evidence and support, and really building evidence and support for your own city to increase funding, but also for other cities that are looking to your city and evidence that this policy is working in your city. Next slide, please. CityHealth and the NCCRC have developed medal criteria, and I'm just going to very quickly go over the gold medal standard. So a city will be awarded a gold medal when it has a legal support for renters policy that includes either an evaluation or an evaluation and reporting element that covers, that provides limited coverage and the enhanced coverage that I covered in the previous slide. And that also provides representation to all eligible tenants. And note that there's explanations below that table right there on the slide, which for the gold medal, eligibility means all tenants. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, there are three case studies that we highlight that we present in the report. So in New York City, it was the first city to implement a legal support policy, legal support for renters policy, a right to counsel. That happened in 2017. The Office of Civil Justice has now done 4 evaluations. They are all available online for your review. The 2021 evaluation has recorded major findings. So every tenant with a calendared eviction case had access to counsel, access to the right to counsel services, and 84% of households that were represented in an eviction case were able to remain in their home, which is astounding. Next slide, please. Cleveland's right to counsel, passed in 2019, was implemented in the summer of 2020 and has been now operating since that time. The policy limits representation to those whose income is 100% or less of the federal poverty guidelines and that person occupies a dwelling with at least one child. The 2021 independent evaluation done by Stout, Rissius, and Ross found, so these are the findings that come out of that evaluation. So 93% of clients who received right to counsel services avoided an eviction judgment or an involuntary move. And kind of a critical finding that is connected with the rental assistance programs that are now up and running and continuing in so many jurisdictions because of the pandemic, is that of the clients who found that rental assistance was available through the right to counsel program, 83, and then they sought it, 83% were able to receive it. And that was with the assistance of legal aid, the legal services provider. Next slide, please. Finally, the last case study we present in the report is the one on San Francisco, which also enacted a legal support for renters policy in 2019. And that policy is really a standout. It was done by ballot initiative. It's the first universal right to counsel, meaning that all tenants are eligible for these services. There's no income eligibility, and it covers administrative cases. In an evaluation of the program between March and December of 2021, it was found that 59% of fully represented tenants remained in their homes, but of the 30% of fully represented tenants that had to vacate, 70% were able to get an agreement to leave that provided them with the sufficient time and money to do so. This is critical because eviction proceedings are so fast, they're so quick. This finding really highlights the benefits of providing a right to counsel legal support for renters policy. And I think our next slide allows us to open this up to questions. And that's what we'll do now. So we'll take some questions about the report, and then we'll move on to the next section of the presentation.
So I see there is a question about whether in cities that provide representation to tenants, whether there's also representation for pro se landlords. And that is, it's an excellent question. The thinking on landlords has been, as we discussed earlier, the vast majority of them already have access to representation. And for those that don't, when cities have and states have offered representation, it's generally been at an income limit, and those income limits are at a level where most property owners would not qualify. That's actually, in fact, in one instance where there was a pilot program run where both landlords and tenants were offered free representation if they were income eligible. There weren't any takers on the landlord side, despite that service being offered. And that, again, given the indigency requirements, that is not altogether surprising for that fact. The other consideration is, when we look at what we can do with scarce resources, we focus on the tenants typically because, again, the interests at stake for them tend to be more severe, the consequences of losing. And while a landlord can potentially be in a very jeopardized position if they are relying on the rent for their own mortgage, that tends to be far more the exception rather than the rule in terms of what we see in the market. And the right to counsel is trying to aim at the sort of broad generality of what exists as best we can. But we do understand that there are going to be some circumstances where you might have a landlord that falls exactly into that bucket where they are indigent and are relying on this income for their home, and they may not be served by that program. There's also a question about in mediation, which is a great question, and actually one that we get asked quite a bit about what role mediation has in a right to counsel environment. And the answer is, what we've seen for mediation is that the programs that are instituted that take place after the eviction has been filed tend to be less successful than the ones that take place before the eviction is filed. And that makes sense because at the point when an eviction has been filed, the landlord has already invested in the filing fee. They've already hired an attorney to represent them. So maybe their instinct or their desire to settle is probably less in that environment than before they filed an eviction. But also where the tenants have not had counsel, the limited studies that have been shown have suggested that the results of mediation are basically the same as would happen to the tenant if they didn't go through mediation. They are evicted at the same rate. The terms are basically the same. And so there's some skepticism that post-filing mediation can be a meaningful contribution to the process without representation. But with lawyers, if the lawyers are there for mediation, and if those lawyers are going to stay with the tenant after mediation and not simply just be there for the mediation alone, then it can potentially be impactful. And I think we have sorry to just answer one more question. I would like to, these are all great questions. And the question about San Francisco, I will just say where they are providing counsel without an income limit, the early data suggested that 85% of the tenants who availed themselves from it, of the right to counsel, were extremely low or low income, and another 8 to 9% were of moderate income. So almost everyone that actually availed themselves of the program was within the target demographic, in terms of economics of what you would imagine for a program like this. So it was not the case where you had lots of high earners, taking advantage of a free government program. That's just not what happened in San Francisco. And there are 15 cities with such a policy in place. We can drop a link in the chat for that, so you can see where those are. We have them mapped out on our website. So we will, I will just take 30 seconds to just say that getting legal professionals to actively participate is definitely a challenge that the industry is facing. But I will say that it's not right to counsel alone that's facing that challenge. The whole legal services industry right now is facing a shortage of attorneys. So we are, that's something we're actively working on in terms of developing recruitment in the law schools and getting more attorneys involved early on in their careers in getting excited about this kind of work.
John and Maria, I just want to say thank you both so much for that recap, also answering questions really in a beautiful, detailed way. I'm also very appreciative that you're giving evictions the human face that they so justly deserve, and that hopefully through this work we can prevent more of that, the human side and the human impact of eviction. So thank you both so much. I'm hoping we can get into a little more detail in this conversation. So to that end, I am thrilled to introduce today's panel. First up, I'm going to introduce Council Member Helena Moreno. Since her first election to the Council in 2017, Council Member Moreno has built a reputation as a tireless advocate on behalf of the people of New Orleans. Over the past 4 years, she has led the fight for a safer, more affordable, more equitable, and more accountable city. Prior to serving the city of New Orleans, Councilmember Moreno represented her district in the Louisiana House of Representatives, and before entering public service, Councilmember Moreno began her career in New Orleans as an investigative reporter for an NBC affiliate. She was part of a team awarded an Emmy for outstanding coverage during Hurricane Katrina. And I will also note that Councilmember Moreno's fantastic chief of staff, Andrew Tizzolo, is stepping in right now because she is actively on the dais.
It's actually over my shoulder. I don't know if y'all can see my TV, but on the dais right now there. So I apologize for that.
Not at all. And we're so thrilled to have you, Andrew. And if the council member can make it, we would love to have her, but so glad to have you on the webinar today and to hear about the experience in New Orleans. Next,
Sure.
we have...
Glad to hear. Thank you.
Wonderful. Next, we have Dr. Kate Leifheit, Assistant Professor of Pediatrics at the University of California. Dr. Leifheit's research seeks to identify social policy levers to improve population health and health equity with a focus on housing policy. Her recent work explores residential evictions as a driver of poor health for children and communities. And to round out our discussion, we have John Pollock of NCCRC. You've heard from John, and he and his team have been instrumental in helping pass right to counsel legislation in numerous municipalities and states. Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you guys here today. So I'm going to ask a general question to start the ball rolling, and I would love for anybody to answer this. Legal support for renter policies are gaining momentum throughout the country, starting with New York City becoming the first jurisdiction to pass a right to counsel in 2017 to now more than 15 cities. John just mentioned this, and 3 states having adopted the policy today. I'd love to know, what do you all think has attributed to this growth in this particular policy area over the past 5 years? And what does the future look like for a guaranteed right to counsel?
I'm happy to answer from my perspective. I'd love to hear Andrew's perspective from the city as well. From our national vantage point, I think that the motivators have been massive interest and drive from tenant organizers who have made right to counsel a priority issue. That has absolutely been transformative in the movement. Tenant organizers have always been incredibly effective, but they have a lot of things they're trying to tackle, and right to counsel has more recently become a priority, I think, and that in part I think is due to the passage initially of the right to counsel in New York City, which is the largest city in the country, has hundreds of thousands of evictions a year. With a city of that size passing a right to counsel, it sort of took the mystique off of the idea of doing it, made it seem much more realistic, much more possible for cities of much smaller size to follow New York City. The results that have come out of New York City and San Francisco and Cleveland and Boulder, the earliest adopters, have been stunningly successful. So it's backstopping the evidence we already had about how effective representation is. And lastly, I think the pandemic, really, it just threw, literally tens of millions of people into potential eviction situation, facing eviction, with only sort of the moratorium and other things stemming the tide temporarily. And it made policymakers look and say, we can't, this is a problem that we have to deal with. We can't just let this happen. And when they were looking at what kinds of solutions they could have, yes, rental assistance, yes, other protections, but right to counsel was something that was known, something that worked, and that there was increasing bipartisan support for. I love the fact that the surveys that were done last year showed that across the political spectrum, right to counsel was supported, no matter who you were asking. So there was political cover for it as well. Enough work had been done by organizers and legal services and people like ourselves to change the messaging around why tenant representation is so important, that it became less about, do we need this, and more about how do we actually accomplish it?
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't think anything we do in the city council gets done without the work of activists and advocates. We certainly we have worked closely for years with the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, formerly New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, who have spearheaded a lot of tenant and frankly, all sorts of sort of civil rights causes here in New Orleans and throughout Louisiana, because we've got a number of things on our plate here, and so it's really critical to have not just the advocacy, but also the technical expertise and the connection to advocates and activists across the country to bring experiences and convey information. I believe we're the only city, I know we're the only city in Louisiana, one of the only cities in the Gulf South that have a tenant right to counsel. And so I think for us, one of the things we noticed, and I think this was mentioned before, and I hate to repeat some of the statistics, is locally for us here in New Orleans, we're a fairly small relative to New York City. And we had, our city is about 50-50 renters owners. So we have a high level of renters here in New Orleans. And I think from our statistics, I think someone said 6% or 4%, I can't remember what someone said here, of tenants facing eviction have counsel. It was here in New Orleans, it was about 95% did not have counsel, which I think is pretty typical across most of these circumstances. And the great waves of displacement and disorder that the pandemic caused, now the sort of endemic circumstance has caused, and then the waves of federal intervention when we had eviction moratoriums and we had federal financial support, but the way that a lot of those came, they came and then they went. And so, we all know the great cost of evictions beyond that of the trauma that it causes to families and to people who are marginally housed, but also to the community from, just the lack of opportunity from employment perspective. You get evicted, obviously makes it much harder to get to work in the morning. It's much harder to get the kids to school in the morning. There's so many different areas of expense that displacement causes, both emotional and financial. So we saw that opportunity. And so for us, we were able to craft a program that, partners the city with a nonprofit legal services vendor is sort of a bad word for it, but sort of partner, a collaborator And we actually have an expansive, it's not just for evictions, right? So there are a number of opportunities where you might be in court where you need some legal representation around eviction, some different disputes that sort of arise from eviction or adjacent to eviction. So we were able to give sort of a broad breadth of opportunity for people. I want to stop talking now, but I just want to say, we're sort of in the infancy of our program. We're 6 months from passage. So we're sort of in the infancy of ours, but we're expecting next year to sort of have some, I hope we do get some sort of study or some sort of applied opportunity to get somebody to show us how effective we know it will be effective, but it sounds like there's some really great research going on. So I'm happy to talk more, but I'll probably turn it over to my colleagues here.
Andrew, I love how you mentioned, yes, there was federal support. Yes, there were federal moratoria, but we need a local solution to local problems. And I really appreciate the fact that you also brought in some of that trauma that is caused by evictions. And I think that leads us nicely into a question specifically for Kate. Eviction, as Andrew noted, has a cascading effect on individuals and families and communities, including on one's mental and physical health. How can legal support for renters policies improve health by reducing evictions?
Right. So we know that evictions are associated with housing insecurity and homelessness. I think that's sort of a no-brainer. And consequently, legal support for renters has the ability to improve housing security for communities. But I think what we don't talk enough about is how evictions also cause sickness and death. So when families are evicted, they experience tremendous amounts of stress, the costs associated with moving. They might have to move into a neighborhood with less resources or worse quality housing. They can have more exposure to infectious diseases. We're breaking ties with communities, social ties, and we're also separating people from their routine health care. So consequently, we see that evicted people have increased risk of health outcomes like preterm birth, low birth weight, food insecurity, problems with cognitive development in kids, anxiety and depression across the age spectrum, increased risk of COVID-19 illness and death, substance use problems, suicide, short-term mortality. The list goes on. So this illness and disability affects people's ability to work. It also leads to increased healthcare costs. So a really well done study found that evictions lead to 29% more hospital visits and 2 times as many hospitalizations for mental health. And then another study found that when evicted people are accessing our healthcare systems, their care incurs 20% more costs than non-evicted people that are otherwise comparable. So when we talk about evictions, it's a public health issue, and it's also a burdensome issue with respect to our healthcare systems.
I really appreciate the fact that you're highlighting not only the human scale that we're looking at in terms of impacts, but also some of the economic impacts. And I'd love to shift to John just to talk a little bit about how much many Americans are paying as a portion of their total income towards rent. Currently, nearly half of all renters pay more than 30% of their income on rent, and 15% pay at least 50% of their income on rent alone. Compounding the problem is that rents are rising. The US Census found that rent was 23% higher in 2022 compared to 2019, and that was prior to the pandemic. With this affordability challenge confronting so many renters, how can legal support for renters work with other local housing policies to make sure we're keeping residents housed?
It's a great question. The right to counsel is not a silver bullet. It can't fix everything. And what we're dealing with here is a big upstream problem of housing affordability that's pushing a lot of people into evictions. It is important to note that, while most evictions are about non-payment of rent, that does not mean the tenants have not actually paid the rent or that they're being charged properly, which is why this isn't just a question of, the tenant didn't pay, so what are we going to do about it? Like, there's actually stuff to litigate about the actual cost that they're being charged with. So it's important, and that's part of the reason why they need a lawyer. But in terms of, the real affordability issues, tenants who have simply gotten into places where they can't afford the units, that has a lot to do with the lack of affordable housing. And that's a significant problem. So, one thing we loved about this report that we collaborated on is that it addressed the need for affordable housing as an upstream intervention, because that will reduce the pressure on the eviction system and in turn the pressure on right to counsel. If you don't have as many people going into eviction, the cost of a right to counsel goes substantially down. So we really see that as intimately connected. The other thing is that, and this is really connects to Kate's research, is about when people are pushed into substandard housing, which is what happens when you don't have enough affordable housing, when people don't have enough money, then the health issues that arise from those units are substantial. And what tends to happen then is that and Kate, really, I would love to hear speak more to this, but there's loss of income that's related to that, as a result of being pushed into that housing. But there's also evictions that happen because the tenants are fed up with the conditions of the unit and they will stop paying. And then they get into a tussle with the landlord about that. And it winds up in court where the tenant doesn't know the law. They don't know what rights they have to do that. They don't know how to exercise those rights in a way that will actually protect them. So all of that is caused by them winding up in substandard housing in the first place. So, really, there's such an interconnectedness between all of these policies. You need to have better healthy housing and you need to have affordable housing. And then you need to have a right to counsel to make those policies actually meaningful, so that they don't just go unenforced.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate the fact that thinking about this as a multifaceted issue, because housing is. I'll just take a moment and just note, CityHealth used to have one housing policy. It was inclusionary zoning. We quickly realized that's not a large enough menu. That policy is not applicable in all areas. It is a very sound policy, but it is not one that has resonance in all 75 cities across America. So John, I really appreciate your talking about this in a multifaceted way. Kate, I'm hoping we can transition a little bit and use John's comments as a way to springboard to talk a little bit about equity and health equity. So all of the policies that CityHealth endorses have an equity focus, and we try to include specific criteria that are designed to close health and racial disparities. Evictions disproportionately affect people of color. We heard John talk specifically about that, in particular Black women. How can legal support for renter policies act as preventive legal medicine to advance racial and health equity?
Right, because evictions disproportionately affect people of color and especially women of color, that means that women of color more than any other group experience the negative health effects of eviction. But to put a positive spin on it, that also means that any effective population level intervention that prevents evictions, and from everything we've heard today, right to counsel is certainly one such intervention, that has the potential to narrow racial health disparities and promote equitable health outcomes. So that's the really encouraging part of all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. Andrew, I don't want to put you on the hot spot, but also would love, I know many of our listeners, the folks who have tuned in today, would love to know more about the story about this policy in New Orleans. Is that something you're comfortable talking about, just the process? Sure. What did this look like?
Yeah, I mean, so, Council President Moreno we've been in office for almost 5 years now. And it's the right to counsel is something we had funded in a sort of an ad hoc way during sort of the first year of the pandemic. We had funded it in this sort of like, well, we should put some money in the budget to do this, but how is it going to work? We didn't have a clue really at the time. And so when she was reelected in the fall of 21, we kind of set out, obviously, with some help from our advocate friends, to kind of highlight, well, what are the housing policies we're going to pursue in this new term? There's a few things. So we have an inclusionary zoning policy here in New Orleans. It's really not been very effective. Even when it was passed, it was projected to only create 120 units over 3 years. And the need for affordable units here in New Orleans is in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. We do a report, we don't, but some advocates do a great report every year that highlights that. So we're the first administrative council to put into our capital budget specific funding to build affordable housing. I don't want to get into details because I think it would bore everyone, but basically like many municipalities, we don't have full control over all the housing and other sort of satellite pieces of government. So the housing agency does not work for us. It's a state created agency. It's run by the mayor's appointees, but it just doesn't work the same way as it does, I think, everywhere else. And so the council actually put into our budget money for affordable housing, because I think to y'all's point, one of the critical problems here in New Orleans is unaffordability. It's creeping upwards, right? And we have this tremendous pressure from short-term rentals, which is sort of another sort of place we can go on a different tangent, but it's a tremendous housing inflation pressure. There's just this general sort of people are, I don't want to say escaping. They're leaving other urban areas for quote unquote low cost cities. Unfortunately, New Orleans is not a low cost city, but compared to LA and New York, housing costs are slightly, although not much less, slightly less now, certainly less than Manhattan. And so the housing affordability is such a crisis here. And it's like y'all know, it's really like a stack, right? Housing is like a stack. You have like, expensive housing, middle price housing, low price housing. And as that expense grows up, if you don't fill in lower cost housing, all the marginally housed folks fall out, frankly. And that's when we have to see that from the unhoused population. You see that in a lot of metros here in New Orleans. We have a growing unhoused population. And so, we know the displacement piece is really, really problematic, not just in the interim, but longitudinally, because displacement can cause sort of rippling displacement, right? And once you're unhoused once, there are so many other things that can happen to you and your family, and that during that pendency. And that can lead you to be, and I'm not speaking from a researcher's perspective, but from the perspective of policymaker, that it can lead you to have less opportunities from what we've seen housing in the future. And so preventing those sort of critical, acute circumstances from occurring can deeply change the trajectory of someone's housing opportunity. And so we can't affect affordability as much as we'd like. Like I said, we're first council in, I think, ever to actually invest our bond dollars into building affordable housing, but we're obsessed with just building some units of any kind. Just please build us units, but we just can't do it fast enough. Costs are going up. Obviously, construction costs have gone up. We're not as a connected metro as the Metroplex in the Northeast or even on the West Coast. So a lot of our sort of housing problems are very bespoke in Louisiana. We don't have a lot of metros like ours, and so we also have some political dynamics. So it's ultimately a real challenge for us, but ultimately, you saw, like I said, that we've made some attempts at making some housing policy happen in the last several years, and we've just continued to see all this displacement. So I think this is ultimately one of the best backstops that we could find. That doesn't require us to build units, although we'd like to. That doesn't have the long-term need of effect, but has some short-term, can smooth over the bumps in ways that can change trajectories. And that's what we felt like we could do.
Andrew, thank you for noting kind of that critical piece. You're really looking at that life cycle of somebody's housing trajectory and thinking about ways the city can prevent somebody falling out of housing, which I think is really fascinating. And John, I wanted to follow up with Andrew's specific example of what they've done in New Orleans, and also ask about thinking about cities who might want to adopt a legal support for renters policy, but might be concerned about the cost. New Orleans is obviously taking a very direct approach. What advice would you give to city leaders who are looking to fund a right to counsel?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to make one quick note about some of the things that Andrew pointed to. One of the things we haven't addressed is gentrification, and gentrification is happening in large part because of the lack of right to counsel. Like that, it's because landlords know that if they want tenants out, they can get them out very easily for no reason. Some of that is due to the fact that jurisdictions don't have just cause protections that say that a landlord has to have a reason to not renew the lease. But some of it is also because the tenants, there's no resistance if they try to push a tenant out. Tenants do not know how to effectively resist any effort to push them out for legal or illegal reasons. So that is part of the cost, the sort of cost of housing equation that we need to talk about. And there's much more we could say about gentrification and its evils. that have nothing to do with right to counsel, but I wanted to connect it to this.
John, I want to say one thing. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I
Please.
want to point out one thing you pointed out. I need to be able to say this, is that Louisiana does not have very favorable tenant rights laws, and we don't have control of that. That's at the Capitol, and our state legislature is not tenant friendly. So I just want to put that on the table as saying that we have very little domain over those pieces anyway.
So with regards to the cost, the first thing we say to jurisdictions when we talk about it is, do you know how much you're spending right now on the cost of eviction? They're substantial. Homeless shelters are expensive. Police intervention is expensive. Drug treatment is expensive. Foster care is expensive. Health, everything, emergency medical care is expensive. Everything they're doing right now, because they're not taking care of evictions, they're paying many, many times over in unnecessary intervention costs. And I think Kate really could speak to that much more on the health side than I can. But, the first thing we say is you have to look at how you're spending. The money is there. You have it. You're just not spending it in a way that makes sense. So the first thing we do is to encourage them to look at that. And the studies that Maria referenced back that up, the studies that Stout has done. The second thing is, if the money is not there from general revenue, there are other places to look for it. During the pandemic, and even now, there's still federal relief money that's available that could be used for representation. The emergency rental assistance money, a component of that can be used for right to counsel. So can the fiscal recovery funds dollars that were part of the American Rescue Plan. Places are using that. Some places are looking at raising filing fees, which are really, really low in some places for evictions. Some places are creating new fees or on like registration of landlord units, or looking at capital gains taxes, or lots of, basically places are getting really, really creative in figuring out where the money can come from. We're not, yes, a lot use general revenue, but other places are getting, and we can help, in that exploration if people are interested in that reach out. But yeah, as far as the costs go, Kate probably could say a word about just how expensive medical care is when we don't treat these problems.
I was actually going to ask Kate to have the final word. You all have talked beautifully about the reasons why this policy makes sense and ways to implement it, ways to fund it, ways to find ways, to look for political will for this, working with activists as well as tenants' rights organizations. Kate, I would love for you to kind of look back a little bit and reflect on the pandemic and the lessons learned, and maybe even project a little bit forward. And I'd love to know what of those lessons do you hope we bring into the future in terms of making sure people stay housed, that they stay safe, and that we can protect lives.
Yeah, so I think the pandemic really brought to the forefront these connections between housing, stable housing, and health. And people were talking about it in a way that was new, and policymakers were innovating and putting a lot of protections into place that we never would have thought possible previously. So I think it's a really encouraging moment. And I think it's a moment that we have to leverage and really push for interventions like right to counsel. I'll also say we've talked a lot about costs, and I know it's an important angle for city governments, but of course, stable housing is a human right. And so I think there's also a moral imperative to act.
Really appreciate that. Thank you to all of you. Andrew, we got to give you an honorary mention here because you pitch hit and you were wonderful. Thank you so much for bringing your perspective about New Orleans and what New Orleans is doing in this space. Thank you to John and to Kate as well for bringing your expertise and your knowledge to bear here. I hope folks who were able to join us today take some of these solutions back with you to your respective communities. I would also encourage you to explore our new report covering all of our local housing policy solutions, and you can see that you can actually find it at our website, which my colleague Tom has posted right here, cityhealth.org. A recording of this webinar will also be on our website. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues and anybody who works in this space. Please connect with us on social media, and we want to make sure you get the latest on all of our policy solutions. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Have a good one.